all make mistakes. And I think that when it comes to sewing mistakes, I have definitely made them all. I don't know about you, Haley.
Oh, for sure.
So today we are going to be talking about the top 10 sewing mistakes that we see in hopes that it's going to save you a lot of frustration. And stay tuned to the end because we're going to share the number one sewing mistake that we see. Okay, mistake number one. I know this is a big one for you, Haley. Not pressing.
It's my number one sewing pet peeve. I think it can be really tempting when you're like, you have a good roll going, you're sewing, you want to keep sewing, to not want to pause and press, or to save everything to the end. But ultimately, I think that your project just suffers from this approach to pressing. Learn to love pressing, press often, and you can become a pressing nerd like me.
One thing that I like to do with pressing to save a little bit of time is to sew things up to the point where you need to press. So for example, if you're sewing two seams, but they're not going to be crossed seams, so you can press both of them at the same time. So you could sew both seams and then press both seams. If they're going to be crossed, if they cross each other, then you'll need to press one and then sew the other. But you just keep that kind of thing in mind. It can save you a little bit of time.
Yeah, I think it is a really good way to kind of practice that batch sewing, practice that really great skill of reading your instructions in advance so you can do all of that kind of stuff all batched together. So you get the satisfaction of continuing your sewing roll without the drawbacks of not pressing. That leads us to mistake number two, which is not reading the pattern instructions.
Yeah, I think that is something that's also can be really tempting to do, especially as you get more advanced and you might think that you know exactly how to do it, but you don't necessarily know what the intent was with that particular pattern. You don't necessarily know the seam allowances, things like that. I find it really helpful to at the very least, just do a read through of the entire instructions before I start sewing so I know what's going on. And then usually I'll still follow step by step, but at the very least, do a read through of the instructions so you really understand what the intent is.
And by not reading the instructions, you're really making an assumption about the techniques that the pattern is going to use. And if there's anything that I've learned about sewing, is that there are so many ways to do any one particular technique. So you might be missing out on really great learning opportunities by not reading the instructions.
That's true. And I also think the pattern and the instructions, they really talk to each other. And if you haven't read through the instructions, you don't know what adjustments were made to the pattern for the techniques that are in the instructions. So it's really helpful to think about them in conjunction. So mistake number three is not measuring your body and just choosing a size based on what you think you normally wear in ready-to-wear clothing that you buy at a store.
The fact of the matter is that most ready-to-wear utilizes something called vanity sizing. So what vanity sizing is smaller number sizes. So at the Gap, you might wear a size 6, where in other manufacturers, you're going to be wearing a larger size. They think that they're selling you on their brand by selling you a garment with a smaller number on it. And we know that numbers are just data, and we never want to assume when it comes to data. So always measuring your body with each new project, because changes happen and that is okay, and treating those numbers as data and choosing your pattern based on the facts and not based on any assumptions that you may be making.
Yeah, I know my waist size, for example, goes up and down, 1 or 2 inches throughout the year. It's just how it is. It's totally normal. And I think also the thing to keep in mind is that every clothing manufacturer has different sizing. So you might be used to wearing a certain size, but if you went to a totally different department store or brand, you'd be wearing a completely different size. So just go by the measurements. It's the easiest way to get the best fit.
Mistake number 4 is not making a muslin.
That is another one of those things where it feels like you're going to save a lot of time by not going through the process of sewing the entire garment twice. But a lot of times it's really going to save you a lot of time and energy if you just make a practice garment and see what the fit's going to be, or what adjustments you need to make, if any, and even get a sense of what the fabric's going to perform like. So I think making a muslin, although it's not necessarily for every project, I don't make one for every single project, But for those where I have a sense that maybe the fit is something that I'm going to need to play around with, or I'm not quite sure how something's going to look or where it's going to sit on my body, making a muslin is just really, really helpful. And I think another thing to keep in mind with a muslin is that it doesn't necessarily have to be the entire garment, every single step. Like you don't need to necessarily put in zippers or put in buttons or do all the finishings or the facings. There's a lot of steps that you can just skip completely. Maybe not for every muslin, but for the vast majority, I would say. And so it's not really making the garment twice. It's just kind of making a mock-up of the shell.
And in my experience, it always takes a lot less time than you think it's going to take.
Yeah. All right. Number 5, and this one's for you, Sienna, behind the camera here. Don't sew when you're tired or hangry. So if you're feeling tired, that's not the right time to sew.
Yeah, I think it can be really tempting to just keep going when you are having so much fun sewing, but there is a breaking point where you are ignoring your bodily needs, like, sleep and eating, and it's time to just stop. I definitely do not recommend making buttonholes late at night when you it's past your bedtime. Go to sleep. Don't make buttonholes. They're going to make you mad.
Yeah, I think this is something that I've definitely done in the past, which is just try to plow through, and it doesn't feel good when you have an hour left of sewing to do and you know that you're gonna have to come back to it the next day. You want to just plow through and finish it. But usually this doesn't make for happy times in my experience.
And I always end up making way more mistakes. It always takes longer than you think it's going to. So if you feel like you're getting into this danger zone, just stop.
Yeah, and even beyond the mistakes, it's just not as enjoyable. Like it starts to become not fun. And I think that's actually the worst thing about it, because it kind of plants this idea in your mind that sewing isn't necessarily something to enjoy. It's just something to get through. And that feeling, I think, can persist even after you're finished with the project. So it's important that you really make sure that you're loving your experience of sewing as much as you can. It's not always going to be fun, but as much as you can.
Mistake number 6 is being a magpie and not making things that you're actually gonna wear.
Yeah, so when we say magpie, what we mean is you're just attracted to the latest shiny object. So you see something new that looks exciting. Maybe it's like a trend that you saw on Pinterest or something somebody else made, or it might be, I don't know, a fabric that has a wild print on it, and you don't really consider yourself in it. You don't really consider your own style, what you like to wear, what you're going to be comfortable in, what your lifestyle is. And I think that's really the beauty of sewing, is that you can make things that are tailored to who you are as a person. So I think it's a hard thing to overcome, because that's kind of how we're conditioned, is to, want what we see a lot of. But I think sewing is a great way to kind of overcome that and really investigate what you need.
And ultimately, I think that by continuing to gravitate towards those types of projects, you're going to feel like, I'm not wearing the things that I make. It's going to feel like maybe not the best use of your time if you're spending all of this time on a skill and you're not utilizing, the fruits of your labor. And that's not like a really good feeling. So being honest with yourself and really exploring your personal style is a really fun and exciting thing to get into.
Mistake number 7 is letting your fear hold you back from trying new things.
So this could be, a fabric in your stash that you love, but you are just too afraid to cut into. It can be that mindset that a skill or a pattern is too hard for you, aren't prepared to take it on. I think that bringing that fear mindset into your sewing is going to take away a lot of the joy of it. Part of the fun of sewing is challenging yourself and trying new things. So I would just really encourage you to go for it.
Yeah, have a little sewing chutzpah.
Mistake number 8 is a simple one, but it is such a big one, and it is not pre-washing your fabric.
So if you're not familiar, pre-washing is basically treating your fabric however you're going to be treating your final garment. And the main point of this is to get rid of any shrinkage in your fabric so that your garment doesn't shrink after you've made it. So that's something that's really important. There are other things, you'll be able to see what the real texture is like, what the actual fabric's going to look like after washing. So it is super important that you do pre-wash your fabric. And we actually have a video about this. It's called, Do You Really Need to Pre-Wash Your Fabric? And we'll link to that below. Mistake number 9 is picking out the wrong fabric.
There are a few things that you could do to avoid this mistake, which can really make or break a project. I would say the first thing is to check out what the pattern recommends. The pattern maker has obviously interacted with this pattern a lot, probably sewn countless versions of it, so they really have a good idea of the types of fabrics that are going to work really well for this particular garment. The next thing you can do to avoid this mistake is to take to social media. You can go on Instagram, you can go on the Seamwork community, and check out what other people are making it in, and you might learn a thing or two. You might be really inspired to make yours out of something similar, or you might be inspired to avoid a mistake that they made.
Yeah, I think there's so much to say about this. And one thing that I want to emphasize with this one with fabric, and I know you and I have talked about this, Haley, this is probably a mistake you're going to make a lot.
Yeah.
And it's probably going to come up throughout the life of your sewing. So even when you become experienced, you're still going to occasionally pick out the wrong fabric.
I do it.
Yeah, it's just how it is.
Yeah.
In ready to wear, it's different because they're testing the garment in that particular fabric over and over. When you're sewing at home, you're choosing a different fabric every time. So there's going to be times where it just doesn't work out. But I think it's something that you have to kind of look as a learning opportunity and see how you can learn from it. And there's always something to learn from it. You can always learn a little bit more about fabric that way. And to see an example of how this affected me recently, I have a video up that's about the Joss pants that I made, and I ended up buying a fabric that I was not in love with. And I made the pants anyway, and if you want to see how they turned out and what I thought about the whole experience, definitely go check out that video. It was really fun.
And finally, number 10, which is probably the most important sewing mistake, is not practicing a new technique before you try it out on a garment.
Yeah, that's a big one. And I think it affects beginners particularly, but it really affects everybody. And the fact of the matter is that learning a new technique in sewing, it's not just a matter of understanding what you're doing, understanding the technique abstractly, but really building the motor skill around it. So really having that muscle memory, understanding what your hands and your eyes are doing, your body is doing. So that is really important, is just to practice a technique before you implement it in a project. And that's really a foundation of our Learn to Sew for Absolute Beginners course. We really walk you through all of the component skills of sewing, and we have you practice each one. You actually build this really cool sample journal of all of the skills that you've learned along the way. So it's really cool. We'll put a link to the course below if that's something that you're interested in. So those are our top 10 mistakes that we see, but maybe you think we missed something. If you did, leave a comment below and let us know what you think is a big mistake in sewing that you often see. We would love to hear from you. And we will see you next week. Mistakes. And I think when it comes to sewing mistakes, I've made them all personal. Oh, I just hit my mic, sorry.
Part of the fun of sewing is challenging yourself and seeing, I'm searching for a word. Challenging yourself. Sorry,
trying new things.
And trying new things. Yeah. Okay.
So it is super